Let me ask you a question. Have you ever stumbled on a YouTube channel and you can't really explain why, but it feels like you're not supposed to be there? Like you clicked something that isn't really illegal and it isn't forbidden, but it feels like a door that should have been locked. Because the videos aren't polished, they're not viral, they're not even good in the way the internet rewards good. They're just there. Hours of someone talking to a camera, cartoons, personal mythologies, rants that don't quite land like jokes. And then, every once in a while, you hit a sentence that makes your stomach drop because it's not edgy, it's not trolling, it's almost a confession. Here's the part that messes with me the most about this story. This was not a mystery. This wasn't one of those true crime cases where we spend 2 hours trying to piece together what happened and who did it and why. The why was being uploaded in real time. And that's what makes it a Nerd Crime Files episode. Because this isn't just about a tragedy in a workplace. It's about what happens when someone builds an identity online that starts feeling more real than their actual real life. It's about what happens when content becomes a countdown. In the early hours of June 8th, 2007, at a Weiss Markets in Eaton Township, Pennsylvania, a 24-year-old employee killed 3 coworkers and then killed himself. And after it happened, investigators and journalists were not digging through some secret vault. They were watching what he had already posted. A trail of videos, journals, and social posts under the name Andrew Blaze that authorities say documented disturbing thoughts and plans. Which means this story isn't just about what he did. It's about how loud it was before it ever happened. Hey, and welcome to, or welcome back to, another episode of the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, the guy who still thinks the scariest words on earth are, "This video is unlisted." And today, we're kicking the door back open on Nerd Crime Files, the series where we look at moments where something went terribly wrong and fandom, internet culture, or nerd spaces are somewhere in the DNA of the story. Not because nerds are dangerous, and not because the internet causes violence, but because sometimes the internet becomes the room where a collapse happens in public, and a content warning right up front. We're talking about a real workplace mass killing and suicide. I'm not going to do gore, and I'm not going to sensationalize, and I'm not going to turn the killer into a character. This episode is about the victims, the warning signs, and the systems that failed to catch someone who was waving a giant red flag on a public platform. All right, let's get into it. So first thing we got to do before we talk about YouTube, before we talk about Andrew Blaze, before we talk about the how did nobody stop this part, we have to talk about the boring truth. Because most of these stories don't start with violence. No, they start with quiet. They start with someone who doesn't feel like they fit in anywhere. And the internet, especially YouTube, has always been the promised land for that kind of person. Because YouTube doesn't ask for charisma first. It just asks for consistency. It never asks you to be liked. It just asks you to upload. And if you're lonely, if you feel unseen, if you're stuck in a life that feels like a hallway with no doors, a camera can start feeling like a friend. And not because it loves you, but because it listens. And that's where this story begins, with just an ordinary guy in an ordinary town, working an ordinary job, and building a world online where he could be someone else. Now, real quick, here's the anchor point we can confirm. On June 8th, 2017, Randy Robert Stair killed 3 coworkers inside a Weiss Markets in Eaton Township, Pennsylvania, and then killed himself. The victims were Terry Lee Sterling, Victoria Brong, and Brian Hayes. One coworker escaped unharmed and called the police, and authorities later tied the Andrew Blaze social presence directly to Stair, describing extensive online material that documented troubling thoughts and plans. That's the spine. Now we need to zoom out, because what makes this story uniquely chilling isn't just the crime, it's the buildup to the crime. It's the fact that, according to the district attorney, there was a long online trail, including a 42-minute film posted around the time of the killings. So the big question becomes, how does someone upload that kind of darkness, and the world still treats it like just another weird YouTube channel? Because here's something we don't talk about enough when we talk about YouTube. A channel is not just a platform. It's almost like a room. It's a room where you decide when people enter, where you decide what they get to see, where you can stop recording the moment things feel uncomfortable. And for someone who feels powerless everywhere else in their life, that control can almost feel intoxicating. Early on, the videos were not violent. They weren't even alarming in the way true crime audiences expect. They were just awkward, rambling, repetitive. A guy talking to a camera about cartoons, animation ideas, and personal thoughts that didn't quite land like jokes. But they didn't feel like cries for help either. And that is very important, because most warning signs don't announce themselves as danger. They instead announce themselves as oversharing. And this is where we have to be kind of careful, because it's totally easy, after the fact, to go back and say, oh yeah, that's exactly where it started. But at the time, it just looked like another small channel, another lonely creator, another person shouting into the algorithm and hoping it shouted back. And YouTube is very good at normalizing that. If you've ever gone down a rabbit hole of low view count videos, then you know exactly what I mean. There's no polish, there's barely an audience, just someone talking, because talking is better than being silent. And that's where this channel lived. Not viral, not notorious, just present. Now contrast that with his offline life. By all public accounts, he was working a night shift job at a grocery store. A routine job. A job that didn't ask him to be creative, never asked him to be expressive, and didn't ask him to be anything beyond functional. And for a lot of people, that's completely fine. But for someone whose entire internal world is built on imagination and identity, that kind of job can start feeling like erasure. Online, he could be someone else. Offline, he was completely invisible. And when those two worlds don't talk to each other, when the online self starts getting more attention than the real one, that's when the balance begins to shift. And here's the key thing I want everyone listening to understand. This wasn't about fame. This wasn't about making it as a YouTuber. This was about being seen at all. Even if that meant being seen as strange. Even if that meant being seen as unsettling. Because attention, and I mean any attention, still feels like proof you exist. So as the uploads continued, the tone began to change. Not all at once, and not dramatically. Just slowly. The videos started getting longer, more circular, more inward. Less content per se, and more confession. And if you've spent enough time online, you know this phase. It's when a creator stops talking to an audience and starts talking through them. The camera stops being a tool and it becomes a witness. And once that happens, everything feels justified. Because if someone is watching, even silently, then the thoughts must be worth saying, right? And this is where the internet's biggest lie creeps in. That being heard is the same exact thing as being helped. And trust me, it's not. So at this stage, nothing illegal was happening. Nothing that triggered an automatic takedown. Nothing that screamed, call the police immediately. What it screamed was something much harder to respond to. This person is definitely not okay. And the internet is terrible at responding to that. Because platforms are not built for intervention. They're built for engagement. And engagement doesn't ask why someone is spiraling. It just asks how long they'll keep watching. So naturally, the uploads continued, and the room stayed open, and the camera just kept rolling. And by the time anyone realized something was seriously wrong, the channel was not just a diary anymore. It was a place where fantasy, identity, and resentment were starting to fuse together. And once that happens, the story stops being about YouTube and starts being about what happens when someone believes the person on screen is more real than the one in the mirror. You know, there's a moment in a lot of internet stories where things quietly cross a line, and not the obvious line, not the one that gets clipped and shared, the subtle one. The moment where a persona stops being something you see and starts being something you are. Online personas are normal now. Usernames, avatars, handles. We all curate a version of ourselves just for the internet. The difference here is that this persona didn't just represent him, it replaced him. At first, Andrew Blaze looked like what you'd expect from a small niche creator. A name, a vibe, just a little myth-making. But over time, it stopped functioning like a screen name and started functioning like a second self. The videos didn't frame Andrew Blaze as a joke or a stage persona or a bit. They framed him as the real one. And the person behind the camera, that guy was treated like a placeholder, a temporary form, something to escape from. And this is where things start to get dangerous. Because fiction is safe only when you know it's fiction. The moment you start treating fantasy as a destination instead of a metaphor, you stop asking whether it makes sense, and you only ask how to get there. And here's the part that makes this a Nerd Crime Files story. A lot of the ideas he expressed were wrapped in familiar fandom language. Alternate universes, transformation, self-insert narratives, destiny arcs. Shit like that, in most spaces, it's completely harmless. It's creative. It's fun. But when someone is unstable, that language becomes armor because it lets extreme thoughts hide inside storytelling. You're not threatening anyone. You're just writing lore. You're not expressing violent ideation. You're just talking about a character. And the internet, especially fandom-heavy corners, is very bad at asking, hey, are you okay? When everything is framed like content. And another thing that was working in his favor, and I mean that sarcastically, was irony culture. Because irony lets sincerity hide in plain sight. If someone says something disturbing and you're not sure whether they mean it, you laugh, you scroll on by, and you assume it's performance. And that's exactly what happened here. Some viewers were uncomfortable. Some were confused. Some did try to push back. But many treated it like just another weird channel, another oddball creator, another internet thing. Because the internet trains us to assume nothing is real until it trends. So as the persona solidified, the themes began to darken. Not in a sudden, oh no kind of way, and not in a persistent, obsessive kind of way. Death as escape, death as transformation, death as release. Not framed as despair, framed as progress. And that distinction matters. Because despair asks for help. Progress asks for planning. And this is where the camera stops being a diary and starts being an accomplice. Not because it encouraged him, but because it never interrupted him. So let's talk about the audience for just a quick second. because this is where people start to get uncomfortable. Most viewers were not cheering him on. Most weren't egging him toward violence. Most were just watching. And that matters too, because passive witnessing still has weight. When someone uploads dozens of videos talking about death, destiny, and escape, and nothing happens, it reinforces the idea that this is completely normal, or at the very least, completely acceptable. The algorithm doesn't care why people watch. It only cares that they do. And as long as the uploads continue, the system reads that as success. So by this point, the channel was no longer about creativity. It was about validation, about proving that the person on screen mattered more than the person living the life behind it. And once that belief set in, the question stopped being, "Who am I?" and instead becomes, "What do I have to do to make this version of me permanent?" There's a dangerous myth we cling to when stories just like this happen. The myth that there were no warning signs, that it came out of nowhere, that nobody could have known. That myth makes us feel safer, because if it was random, then it could never happen again. But in this case, the warnings weren't subtle. They were just familiar. You see, by the time we reach this phase of the channel, the ambiguity is gone. The videos stop feeling like awkward oversharing and start feeling like preparation. The language begins to tighten. The themes begin to repeat. Death isn't an abstract idea anymore. It's an ultimate goal, an endpoint, something to work towards. And here's the part that matters for evidence and accuracy. According to investigators and the district attorney, there were extensive online postings, including the 42-minute video uploaded around the time of the killings. That video documented violent thoughts and plans. No metaphors, no symbolism, pure planning. And this is where people always ask, how did this stay up on YouTube? And the honest answer is, because platforms aren't built to recognize intent, only violations. If someone doesn't say the exact wrong words, doesn't show the exact wrong imagery, doesn't trigger the exact policy, the system just shrugs it away. So why did his viewers do nothing? And this is the hardest part to talk about without pointing fingers. So we're not going to. Because most people watching, they weren't bad people. They weren't collaborators. They weren't cheering for violence. They were doing something much more common. They were completely unsure. Unsure if it was a bit. Unsure if it was performance art. Unsure if it was just another deeply online persona doing edgy internet bullshit. And the internet trains us to treat discomfort as entertainment. If something makes you uneasy but doesn't directly affect you, you just keep scrolling. You don't escalate. You just assume someone else will. And one thing we need to be crystal clear about in this episode, when someone starts uploading goodbye content, especially repeatedly, that is never nothing. And in this case, authorities later described videos and posts that functioned as farewells. Not emotional goodbyes, logistical ones. The kind that suggest finality. And this is where the internet's biggest failure shows itself. We treat final messages like engagement opportunities. People comment, people speculate, people archive. Very, very few people ever intervene because we've been trained to believe that online life is separate from real life. And sometimes it isn't. There's a specific feeling that creeps into content when someone has crossed a line internally. Everything starts feeling urgent, like time is running out, like every upload matters more than the last. Investigators later said the volume and nature of the material made it clear this was not spontaneous. This was all premeditated, documented, timed, and yet, to the platform, it was still just another upload, another creator, another data point. Sometimes people try to turn cases like this into a debate about censorship. That's a distraction. No one is saying weird art should be banned, and no one is saying dark thoughts should be criminalized. What we're saying is this: when someone repeatedly tells the world they are planning violence, and the world responds with views, silence, or curiosity, that's not neutrality. That's a failure. This was not a secret spiral. It wasn't hidden in code. It wasn't buried in some obscure corner of the internet. It was uploaded, public, time-stamped. And once those warnings were ignored, the story stopped being about whether this could have been prevented and started being about how many chances there were to stop it. So up to this point, everything we've talked about has lived online. Videos, posts, comments, warnings that felt theoretical. But on the night of June 8th, 2017, the internet stopped being a buffer, and the consequences became physical. In the early morning hours, shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, a Weiss Markets grocery store in Eaton Township, Wyoming County, Pennsylvania was closed to the public. Inside the store, a small overnight crew was working. People doing their routine jobs, stocking the shelves, clocking hours, expecting to go back home to their families. One of those employees was Randy Stair, and at some point during the shift, authorities later said he blocked exits inside the store using objects and pallets. He then retrieved firearms he had brought with him and opened fire. 3 of his co-workers were killed: Terry Lee Sterling, Victoria Brong, Brian Hayes. A 4th co-worker managed to escape and call the police. But by the time law enforcement finally arrived, the shooter had already killed himself. Investigators later said nearly 60 rounds were fired. But here's the thing I want to be very clear about. That number, it doesn't matter. And the weapons don't matter. The mechanics don't matter, because none of that explains why this happened. And none of it honors the people who lost their lives. So we don't sit there. We need to move forward. So in the hours and days that followed, the story spread fast. Not because it was shocking. I mean, it was. But sadly, workplace shootings were not unheard of by 2017. But because of what investigators found next. They weren't searching hard drives. They weren't cracking passwords. They were watching what had already been uploaded. His videos, his journals, a long digital trail tied to the online identity we talked about earlier, including what authorities described as a 42-minute video posted around the time of the killings that functioned as a farewell and explanation, which means the crime didn't just leave behind victims, it left behind content. And that's where this story becomes something else entirely. Because after the shooting, the internet did what it always does. It tried to make sense of it by organizing it. Videos were mirrored, posts were archived, timelines were assembled, and not by investigators, by complete strangers. You see, because once something terrible happens online, there's always an instinct to preserve it, to save everything before it disappears. And on the surface, that makes complete sense. We tell ourselves it's about documentation, about learning, about making sure it's never forgotten. But there is a line. In this case, it walks right up to it. After the channel was taken down, copies of the videos began circulating elsewhere. Some people framed it as research, some as cautionary evidence, some as morbid curiosity. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every re-upload keeps the persona alive. Every mirror gives the content a second life. And every second life risks turning a warning sign into a legacy. And that doesn't mean we pretend it never existed, but it does mean we have to ask why we're preserving it. Are we really studying it, or are we consuming it? Because there is a big difference. This story didn't stay in the true crime circles. It floated back into fandom discussions, animation forums, YouTube essays, Reddit threads, because it sits at a very uncomfortable intersection. Creativity, identity, mental illness, and platform responsibility. And nerd spaces do not like to admit this part. We are really good at protecting ideas, but not always great at protecting people. We as nerds will argue endlessly about canon, about headcanons, about whether something is problematic in theory. But when someone is clearly unraveling at the seams in real time, we really don't have a script for that. And let me be very clear about something before anyone even tries to twist this shit. This story is not about censorship. It's not about banning weird art or shutting down dark creativity or policing fandoms. It's about intervention. Because there is a massive gap between this makes me uncomfortable and this is dangerous. And right now, platforms don't know how to bridge that gap. And communities, they don't either. So everyone just waits. And waiting is a decision. Responsibility doesn't mean playing internet detective. It doesn't mean dogpiling someone who's struggling. And it definitely doesn't mean assuming every strange creator is a threat. It just means this. When someone repeatedly talks about death as a solution, when goodbye content becomes routine, when fantasy stops being symbolic and starts sounding instructional, that is not drama. That's a signal. And signals are only useful if someone responds to them. Let me say this. The internet did not cause this, but it didn't stop it either. Before I wrap this whole thing up, there's just one more thing I'd like to talk about. And not about this case specifically, but about why this story feels so familiar if you spend any amount of time in nerd spaces online. Because once you step back from all the details, this isn't just a one-off. It's a pattern. And I think that's what's been sitting in my chest while working on this episode. Here's the uncomfortable truth about a lot of nerd spaces. We do not reward balance. We instead reward intensity. The most obsessed fan is the real fan. The deepest lore diver is the authority. The person who makes it their whole identity gets the spotlight. And most of the time, it's completely harmless. But sometimes, intensity is not passion. It's almost a warning sign we don't know how to read. When someone is pouring everything into a persona, their loneliness, their resentment, their identity, their sense of purpose, fandom does not slow them down. It just hands them a microphone. And another thing we do not talk about enough, the irony culture. Irony lets us engage with disturbing ideas without ever taking responsibility for them. So if something makes you uncomfortable, you don't challenge it. You just joke about it. You say, well, it's the internet. Or you say, they're probably just doing a bit. Or you say, I don't want to be dramatic. You see, irony protects us, but it also isolates them. Because the moment someone is serious and no one treats them like they are, that's when things get dangerous. There's also something psychologists call the bystander effect. Basically, the more people who see a problem, the less likely any one person is to act. And online, that effect is supercharged because you're not in a room with someone. You're just in a comment section. So you assume someone else will report it, or someone else will reach out, or someone else will take it seriously. So no one does. And the platform reinforces that kind of behavior because escalation is not easy. Reporting feels vague, and there's no feedback loop that tells you your concern mattered. So we learn to stay passive. You'll hear people say, well, we just shouldn't platform people like this. And that sounds great, but it's also incomplete. Because in this case, there was no platforming moment. There was no single viral clip, no big boost, no spotlight, just time. Uploads over months and years, which means the real issue isn't amplification. It's just persistence. Someone unraveling slowly in a space designed to host content indefinitely, without any meaningful human intervention. And this is why Nerd Crime Files exists in the first place. Not to gawk, not to moralize, and never to point fingers, but to just say these stories don't come from nowhere. They come from places we recognize, platforms we use every single day, and communities we are actively a part of. That doesn't mean nerd culture is fundamentally broken. It just means it's human. And humans, we miss things, especially when discomfort is easier to scroll past than to confront. So if there's one shift I want us to make as fans, creators, or as viewers, it's just this. Stop asking, is this allowed? And instead start asking, is this someone asking for help in the only way they know how? Because those are very, very different questions, and only one of them prevents the next story. This episode was not about answers. It was just about paying attention. And this is the part that really locked this episode in for me. Once you recognize this pattern, you begin seeing it everywhere. Not the details, just the shape. We've seen it in cases where someone documented their dissent online long before violence ever happened. We've seen it when obsession was mistaken for passion, when ideology or fantasy gave structure to chaos, when the internet treated warning signs like lore. You can draw a straight line through stories just like Elliot Rodger, whose manifesto and videos were online long before the attack, or Nicholas Cruz, who repeatedly signaled violent intent on social platforms. Even cases tied to extremist spaces where radicalization didn't happen in secret. It happened in the comments, in the forums, and on live streams. Different motives, different communities, but the same failure mode. The common thread is not ideology. It's visibility without intervention. And that's why Nerd Crime Files is not a one-off series. Because once you understand this pattern, the question stops being, how did this happen? And instead becomes, why do we keep letting this part of the story play out the same exact way? So future episodes aren't going to be about chasing shock value. They're going to be about tracing these patterns across fandom spaces, online subcultures, and platforms designed for expression and not accountability. Because the scariest part of these stories isn't that they are unique, it's that they are predictable. This case was not an anomaly. It was a warning flare. And if we keep treating those flares like content instead of signals, then we already know how the story ends. And that's the part we have to sit with. So, this is the part of the episode where people usually want a clean takeaway, a checklist, a rule, a villain. And I'm sorry, but I don't have one, because real life does not work like that. But what I can tell you is this. This was not a random act of violence. It was never a mystery. It was not something that came out of nowhere. It was a slow, documented collapse that happened in public, in a space designed to reward attention and not ask questions. This story matters not because of who committed the crime, but because of who didn't see it coming. Even when it was uploaded, time-stamped, and waiting to be watched. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it's this. When someone tells you who they are becoming, especially repeatedly, especially without irony, believe them, not to panic and not to accuse, but to care enough to intervene. Because silence, it is not neutral. And saying it's just the internet has never been true. To the victims, Terry Lee Sterling, Victoria Brong, and Brian Hayes, this story is not content. It's loss. And they deserve to be remembered for their lives and not as footnotes in someone else's collapse. So before I shut this thing down, just real quick, I want to say thank you. Seriously. These heavier episodes only work because you are willing to sit with them. You're willing to listen instead of just scrolling on by. And that means a lot. So as always, shout out to my player 2. Thank you for always supporting the weird ideas and for letting me turn the living room into my recording booth. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes that keep pushing me forward. And shout out to all the day ones. And shout out to everyone who's been rocking with Nerd Crime Files from the jump. So if you got something out of this episode, if it made you think or pause or just sit quietly for just a minute, please do me a favor. Share it with someone you trust. Not to shock them and not to scare them, but to start a conversation. And if you want to keep that conversation going, I've got a private Average Joe Nerdcast Facebook group where this stuff actually gets talked about. Just get on Facebook and search Average Joe Nerdcast, the lobby. And hey, if you haven't already, rate the show, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, and help us keep this thing growing. It genuinely helps more than you think. So until next time, the lobby's always open. Stay gold, nerd bold, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.